My name is Naomi Vance, and I am 34 years old. For the last 10 years, my life has been defined by a silence, a chasm that opened up between me and my father, the celebrated novelist Arthur Vance. My family spent that decade treating me like a ghost at best and a traitor at worst. They were about to throw the biggest, most lavish party of the year to celebrate my father's first ever authorized biography, a book they believed was his ultimate legacy, penned by a stranger. They had no idea that the book wasn't just a biography. It was a confession, a reconciliation, and a reckoning. And they were about to find out, in front of everyone who mattered in their world, that I, the outcast daughter he had publicly and privately disowned, was its acclaimed author. The silence was about to be broken, and the sound was going to bring the whole house down. Before I dive into the story of how a decade of painful estrangement ended in the most public and spectacular way imaginable, I want to say hello to everyone watching. Let me know where you're from in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated or cast aside by the very people who were supposed to lift you up, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all the new viewers, please consider subscribing. This is a community for people who understand that sometimes you have to write your own ending. The story I'm about to tell you began with a single, cruel sentence, a judgment that echoed in my mind for 10 years. It was spoken in my father's study, a room that smelled of old books, pipe tobacco, and for me, the bitter scent of betrayal. I was 24, a freshly minted journalist with a fire in my belly and a portfolio of clippings from a well-respected city newspaper. I had worked tirelessly to get there, deliberately avoiding the long shadow cast by my father's name, wanting to prove that I had talent of my own. My great ambition was to write something meaningful, something that captured a small piece of the human condition with the same honesty he poured into his fiction. And I had an idea, one I thought was born of love and admiration. I wanted to write a feature piece on him. Not a sensational tell-all, but an intimate portrait of his creative process. I wanted to demystify the legend and show the man. I pictured it in the Sunday magazine, a thoughtful, respectful piece about the discipline and the solitude behind his genius. I spent weeks preparing a pitch, treating him not as my father, but as the formidable subject he was. I finally got an audience with him on a crisp autumn afternoon. I walked into his study, the heart of our family home, a room I had always revered. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over stacks of books that reached the ceiling. My father, Arthur, was sitting in his worn leather armchair, a formidable presence even in repose. He was a man built of sharp angles and quiet intensity, his eyes holding a familiar, stormy depth. My Aunt Carol, his younger sister and self-appointed guardian of his legacy, was also there, perched on the edge of a mahogany desk like a hawk. Her presence immediately put me on edge. Carol had always viewed my ambition with suspicion, seeing it as a vulgar departure from the family's more literary pursuits. To her, my journalism was just a step above gossip. I laid out my proposal, my voice steady despite the nervous fluttering in my chest. I spoke of themes, of process, of legacy. I emphasized that he would have full copy approval, that this was about honoring his work. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. My father stared at me, his expression unreadable. Aunt Carol, however, let out a small, derisive laugh. "Oh, Naomi, it's very sweet," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "But Arthur's work isn't something you dissect for a newspaper, dear. It's art, not content." I felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment. "It's a valid form of storytelling, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted. "And it would be a way to connect with his readers on a different level." My father finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Connect with them? Or connect their wallets to your byline?" I flinched as if struck. "What? No, that's not what this is about." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure ice. "Don't play naive with me, Naomi. I know exactly what this is. You've got a famous last name, and you've finally figured out how to monetize it. You're a vulture, circling what you think is a dying carcass, waiting to pick the bones clean for a story." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Vulture. The word hung in the air, grotesque and obscene. I looked at him, searching for some sign he didn't mean it, but his face was a mask of cold fury. My meticulously prepared pitch lay forgotten on the table between us. "That's not true," I whispered, my throat closing up. "I love you. I admire you." This was meant to be a tribute. Aunt Carol seized the moment, placing a protective hand on her brother's shoulder. "Arthur, you see? I told you. She doesn't understand. She sees you as a subject, an angle. It's the nature of her work. It's predatory." My father stood up, his tall frame blocking out the light from the window. He looked down at me, and I had never felt so small. "You have no real talent, Naomi," he said, each word a perfectly polished stone of cruelty. "You have a notebook and an appetite. You want to exploit the one thing of value our family has, because you have none of your own to offer. Get out of my house. And don't come back until you've learned the difference between writing and grave robbing." I stumbled out of the study, blinded by tears. I passed my mother in the hallway. She gave me a look of pained helplessness but said nothing. Her silence was its own form of betrayal. I didn't stop until I was in my car, gasping for air, the word vulture clawing at my insides. That was the day the silence began. The decade that followed was a masterclass in exile. I moved to a different city, carved out a life for myself on my own terms. I never used my father's name to open a door. I wrote under Naomi Wallace, using my mother's maiden name, a small act of defiance that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I built a career piece by piece, writing investigative features that had nothing to do with art or literature. I wrote about city council corruption, environmental negligence, and social justice issues. My work was good. It won regional awards. It made a difference. But every achievement felt hollow, haunted by the ghost of my father's approval. The family reinforced my exile with chilling efficiency. Aunt Carol became the unwavering gatekeeper. My phone calls to my father went unanswered. The few times I tried to send a letter, it was returned unopened. Holidays became a series of painful reminders of my exclusion. I'd see photos on my cousin Marcus's social media feed. The whole Vance clan gathered around a Thanksgiving table, smiling for the camera, a perfect portrait with one person conspicuously missing. Marcus, a perpetually aspiring poet who lived on a generous allowance from my father, would sometimes add a smug caption like, "Family is everything. So grateful for the ones who get it." Each post was a fresh twist of the knife. I remember one particularly cruel instance about 3 years into the silence. It was my 27th birthday. I hadn't expected a call from my father, but a small, stupid part of me had hoped for a card from my mother. Nothing came. Instead, I got a call from Aunt Carol. "Naomi, dear," she said, her voice syrupy with false concern. "I'm just calling to ask you to please give your father some peace. He's been so agitated lately, and your mother is worried sick. These attempts of yours to get back in touch are just upsetting the poor man." I was stunned into silence. "What attempts?" I finally asked. "I haven't tried to contact him in over a year." There was a brief pause on her end. "Well, whatever it is you're doing, it's having a negative effect. He needs calm. He needs to be protected from distractions. You, of all people, should understand that." She was manufacturing a narrative where I was the persistent aggressor and they were the poor victims of my ambition. The gaslighting was so profound, so complete, that I felt a wave of dizziness. I hung up the phone and cried for an hour, not just for the loss of my father, but for the loss of my entire family, who had so willingly participated in my erasure. After that call, I stopped trying altogether. I accepted the silence. I let it become a part of me, a quiet, aching void where my family used to be. I poured all of that pain, all of that rejection, into my work. My writing became sharper, more empathetic. I found the stories of other outcasts, other people who had been wronged by systems of power, and I told their stories with the passion I was no longer allowed to feel for my own. And then, one Tuesday morning, 10 years and 2 months after I had been cast out of my father's study, the world shifted on its axis. I was scrolling through a news aggregator, sipping my coffee, when a headline jumped out at me. Vance biography announced, "Reclusive genius finally breaks silence." My heart plummeted into my stomach. I clicked the link, my hand trembling. The article was from a major publishing house, announcing the first ever authorized biography of Arthur Vance, titled The Silent Quarry. It was slated for release in 1 year. It spoke of unprecedented access, of a story told in the author's own words. And then I saw the name of the writer he had chosen. Julian Croft, a highly respected, almost mythical biographer known for his penetrating studies of difficult artists. I had read Croft's work. It was brilliant, incisive, and deeply psychological. My father had given a stranger the very thing he had accused me of wanting to steal. It was the ultimate, final rejection. A public declaration that anyone in the world was more trustworthy than his own daughter. I felt a familiar cold wave of grief wash over me, so intense it left me breathless. It wasn't just that he had done it. It was that he had done it with someone else, proving that his objection hadn't been to the idea, but to me. My phone rang an hour later. It was Aunt Carol. Her voice was triumphant, practically crowing. "Naomi, have you seen the news? Isn't it just wonderful? Your father is finally getting the legacy he deserves, written by a real author. Julian Croft. Can you imagine? It's going to be a masterpiece." I said nothing, my throat too tight to form words. "We're planning a massive launch party at the estate when it comes out," she continued, oblivious to my silence. "It's going to be the literary event of the decade. Of course, you understand. It would be far too awkward for you to come. It's a celebration of family, and your presence would just cast a pall. I'm sure you get it." "I get it," I managed to say, my voice a dead monotone. I ended the call and sat in my apartment, the silence of my own life suddenly deafening. My cousin Marcus was, of course, already posting about it. A picture of the press release with the caption, "The master's voice will finally be heard, pure and unfiltered. So proud to be a part of the family that protected his genius." I wanted to throw my phone against the wall. Instead, I closed my laptop and went for a long, aimless walk, the city streets a blur of indifferent faces. The story was over. He had written the final chapter, and I wasn't in it. Or so I thought. 3 days later, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from an address I didn't recognize, a jumble of letters and numbers. The subject line was just 2 words, "The Robin's Nest." My breath caught in my throat. It was a code, a secret from a lifetime ago. When I was a little girl, my father had built a small, shoddily constructed treehouse in the old oak tree at the bottom of our garden. He called it the Robin's Nest. It was our secret place. We would sit there for hours, and he would tell me stories. One winter, I had insisted we leave out suet for the birds, and he had patiently explained that the robins had already flown south. I had been adamant that they would come back for the treat. It became a running theme in our private mythology, a symbol of stubborn, hopeful belief. I opened the email with shaking fingers. The body contained a single sentence. "The robins are back in the old oak. You were right about the suet." My heart was hammering against my ribs. After 10 years of absolute silence, after the public humiliation of the biography announcement, what could this possibly mean? Was it a trick? A cruel joke? Or was it something else? My journalistic instincts warred with a decade of carefully constructed emotional armor. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Against all my better judgment, I typed a 1-word reply. "Where?" The response came less than a minute later. It was the name of a dingy, forgotten coffee shop in a town halfway between his home and my city, a place so unremarkable that it was perfectly anonymous. The message concluded with a time and a date, Saturday, 2 p.m. I stared at the screen for a long time, the words blurring in front of my eyes. A decade of silence, and now this. A single, cryptic message had just cracked the foundations of the world I had so carefully built. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I had to go. The drive to the town of Northwood felt surreal, like a journey into a past I had sealed away. The coffee shop, the daily grind, was even more drab in person than I had imagined. It had faded linoleum floors, wobbly formica tables, and the faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was the perfect place to be invisible. I chose a booth in the back corner, my back to the wall, a habit learned from years of interviews. My hands were clammy, and I kept smoothing down my jeans, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had no idea what to expect. An apology? A confrontation? Another, more personal round of accusations? He was 5 minutes late. I watched him walk in, and the air left my lungs. The 10 years had been kinder to him than I'd expected, but they had left their mark. His hair was more silver than salt and pepper now, and there were deeper lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He looked less like the formidable titan of my memory, and more like what he was, an aging man who carried the weight of his own solitude. He spotted me and walked over, his movements slow, deliberate. He slid into the booth opposite me, the worn vinyl groaning in protest. We sat in silence for a full minute, the chasm of the last decade stretching between us. He looked older, more fragile than I had ever seen him. The stormy anger in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, profound weariness. He was the one who finally broke the silence. "Naomi," he said, his voice raspy and used. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. The hurt of 10 years was a physical thing, a shard of glass lodged in my chest. "I know," he said, and looked down at his hands on the table. They were the same hands that had typed masterpieces, the same hands that had built my childhood treehouse. "The biography," I said, unable to stop the words. "Julian Croft. After everything you said to me, you give it to a stranger." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a pain that mirrored my own. "There is no Julian Croft," he said softly. The words hung in the air between us. "What are you talking about?" "He's a famous biographer. I've read his books. He's real, yes," my father clarified. "But he is not writing my book. He's a friend of my publisher, David. He agreed to lend us his name, to act as a placeholder. A ghost." I stared at him, confused. "A placeholder for what? For who?" He took a slow, deep breath. "The publisher has been after me for years. They were relentless. They showed up with an offer I couldn't ignore. And I realized as I got older, I was going to die one day. And if I did nothing, people like Carol and Marcus would be the ones to tell my story. Or worse, some academic who only ever saw the monster, not the man. The thought terrified me. I couldn't let a stranger write it. I couldn't trust anyone with the truth." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Except, I realized as I sat there in my study, maybe there was one person. The only one who ever really understood the work from the inside out. The only person I knew who had the skill to write it and the heart to get it right." My own heart stuttered. I felt a dizzying, terrifying hope begin to bloom in the barren landscape of my chest. "I don't understand," I whispered. "That day," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion I hadn't heard in a decade. "That day in my study, I was a coward. I was terrified. Not of you know me. I was terrified of being seen. Truly seen. My whole life has been about building walls, hiding behind my words. You walked in there with your honesty and your clear eyes, and you wanted to bring light into all my dark corners, and it petrified me. You were the one person who could actually do it, and that made you the most dangerous person in the world to me." He looked down again, ashamed. "What I said to you, calling you a vulture, it was the cruelest, most unforgivable lie I have ever told. I wasn't attacking your ambition. I was attacking your talent, because it was real, and it was a threat to my seclusion. I pushed away the only person who ever truly tried to get in, and I have regretted it every single day for 10 years. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and silent. I couldn't speak. He reached a hesitant hand across the table, not quite touching mine. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Naomi. I know I don't deserve it. I'm asking for your help. I want you to write the book. Secretly. Under the name Julian Croft. I want to give you the story I denied you, but I want us to do it on our own terms. No Carol, no Marcus, no publicity. Just you and me. The way it should have been." The proposal was a bombshell. It was everything I had ever wanted and everything I was terrified of. Could I trust him? Could I open myself up to that kind of pain again? I thought of the decade of silence, the lonely birthdays, the gloating phone calls from my aunt. The wound was so deep. "Why?" I finally choked out. "Why now?" Because I'm old, he said simply. And I'm tired of being alone. And because I miss my daughter. He finally met my eyes again, and the raw vulnerability there was what broke through my defenses. I saw the father from the treehouse, the man who had taught me to love stories. For the next hour we talked. I told him about the pain, about Carol's phone calls, about seeing the family photos online. I didn't spare him the details. He listened, his face ashen, taking every word like a deserved blow. He didn't make excuses. He just listened. And when I was done, he simply said, "I am so sorry, Naomi. I failed you. As a father, I failed you." It wasn't an absolution, but it was a beginning. I thought about the smug look on Aunt Carol's face, the triumphant tone in her voice when she told me I wasn't welcome at the party. A slow-burning ember of an idea began to glow in my mind. Vengeance was too simple a word for it. It was about truth. It was about reclaiming a narrative that had been stolen from me. "Okay," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll do it. On one condition." "Anything," he said. "The first time anyone, including the family, hears that I am the author is at the launch party, from the stage." A slow smile spread across his face, the first I had seen in over a decade. It was a conspiratorial, mischievous smile that I remembered from my childhood. "I think," he said, "that can be arranged." Thus began the year of secret reconciliation. We became partners in a clandestine operation, the goal of which was not just a book, but the painstaking reconstruction of a shattered relationship. Our meetings were carefully orchestrated, held in places where we wouldn't be seen. We rented a small, secluded cabin in the mountains for a week, a place with a roaring fireplace and no cell service. We met in the dusty, forgotten archives of a university library 2 towns over. We took long, meandering drives through the countryside, my digital recorder running on the seat between us. At first, it was like a formal interview. I was the journalist. He was the subject. I asked him about his early life, his influences, the genesis of his most famous novels. He answered dutifully, giving me the polished anecdotes he had prepared for a stranger. But I pushed back. "That's the public story, Dad," I'd say. "What's the real one? What were you afraid of when you wrote that?" Slowly, painstakingly, the walls began to come down. He told me things I had never known. Stories of a lonely, impoverished childhood, of a demanding father who saw his love of books as a weakness. He spoke of the crippling fear of failure that had stalked him his entire life, a fear so profound that he chose reclusion over the risk of public judgment. His novels, I realized, were not just stories. They were fortresses he had built to protect a deeply sensitive and frightened man. In turn, I began to share my own story. I told him about the grueling assignments I had taken, the deadlines I had met, the satisfaction of seeing my work in print under a name that was mine alone. I told him about the loneliness, the feeling of being unmoored from my own history. During one long drive, I told him about Carol's phone call on my 27th birthday. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, switched off the engine, and just stared out the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I never knew," he whispered, his voice choked. "She told me you were happy, that you wanted nothing to do with us. She said she was protecting me from you." The intricate web of deceit my aunt had woven was more complex than I had even imagined. She had isolated us from each other, feeding each of us a narrative that kept us apart, all under the guise of protection. It was in that moment, sitting in a silent car on a deserted country road, that we stopped being a journalist and a subject and became a father and a daughter again. We were 2 people who had been wronged by the same person, finally comparing notes. The healing was not linear. There were days we argued, old wounds reopening under the pressure of a difficult question. There were times I had to walk away, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of it all. But we always came back. We were tethered by the project, by the shared goal of getting the story right. Our only other co-conspirator was his publisher, a kind, shrewd man named David Chen. David was the gatekeeper for Julian Croft, our shield from the outside world. He was the one who managed the official side of things, and he played his part with masterful skill. I'll never forget the conference call we had, where I was introduced to him over the phone as the real author. There was a moment of stunned silence on his end, then a low whistle. Well, I'll be, he said. Arthur, you sly old dog. This is either the craziest or the most brilliant idea you've ever had. David became my staunchest ally. He saw the chapters as I wrote them, providing feedback that was both editorially sharp and deeply empathetic. This is more than a biography, Naomi, he told me during one of our calls. This is a resurrection. It's magnificent. He also had the distinct pleasure of dealing with my Aunt Carol. She called him at least once a month, trying to get details for the launch party, angling for an introduction to the reclusive Mr. Croft. David would regale me with the stories later. She wanted to know Mr. Croft's dietary restrictions for the party, he told me, laughing. I told her he was a very private man who subsisted on truth and strong black coffee. I don't think she appreciated the poetry. He would deflect her questions about the book's content with vague, tantalizing hints. Oh, it's a very intimate portrait, he'd say. It really gets to the heart of the Vance family dynamic. The dramatic irony was so thick, I could barely stand it. As the months went on, the book took shape. It was a dual narrative, the story of my father's life and work, interwoven with the story of our estrangement and reconciliation. It was brutally honest about his failings, his cruelty, and his fear. But it was also imbued with a deep, abiding love and a hard-won understanding. It was the best thing I had ever written. The day I sent the final manuscript to David, I felt a profound sense of both terror and relief. It was done. The story was told. A few weeks later, the formal invitations for the launch party arrived in the mail. Mine was addressed to Naomi Wallace, a generic printed card sent by a third-party event planner. It was a stark, formal reminder of my official status in the family, a distant relation, an afterthought. Holding it in my hand, I felt a flicker of the old pain, but it was quickly replaced by a thrilling sense of anticipation. The stage was set. The night before the party, my father called me. His voice was steady, calm. "Are you ready, my little Robin?" he asked, using the old pet name from the treehouse. "I'm ready," I said, my own voice surprisingly firm. "Good," he said. "It's time for our story to fly." The Vance estate was ablaze with light, a beacon of high society nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. Cars lined the long, winding driveway, and the sound of a string quartet drifted through the warm evening air. I had chosen my armor carefully, a simple, elegant navy blue dress. It was understated, professional, and gave no hint of the emotional maelstrom churning inside me. As I walked in, a wave of whispers followed me, a ripple of curiosity and surprise spreading through the crowd. I was a ghost returning to her haunting grounds, and everyone knew it. It didn't take long for my welcoming committee to find me. Aunt Carol, resplendent in a gaudy jewel-toned gown, and my cousin Marcus, looking smug in a poorly fitting tuxedo, intercepted me near the champagne fountain. "Naomi." "What a surprise," Carol said, her smile as brittle as spun sugar. "I can't imagine this is very comfortable for you. It's so brave of you to show your face." Her words were honey-laced poison. Marcus smirked, sipping his champagne. "Here to get a quote for some tabloid, cousin?" Trying to ride the coattails again. The insult was so predictable, so perfectly in character, that I almost laughed. A year ago, it would have shattered me. Tonight, it felt like a parody. I gave them a small, serene smile. "Hello, Aunt Carol." "Marcus." "It's a beautiful party." My calmness seemed to unnerve them more than any angry retort could have. I excused myself and moved deeper into the throng, feeling their confused, suspicious eyes on my back. I saw my father across the grand ballroom, holding court. He was surrounded by a circle of literary critics and fawning admirers. He looked every bit the legend they believed him to be. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second over the heads of the crowd. He gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the reassurance I needed. The publisher, David Chen, stood near the small stage at the front of the room, looking over his notes. He caught my eye and gave me a warm, conspiratorial wink. The gesture was a small anchor in a sea of tension. I felt like an actor waiting in the wings for my cue. The first part of the evening was a blur of polite conversation and carefully avoided glances. I spoke with a few old family friends who offered me condolences as if I were at a wake, their pity almost as insulting as Carol's scorn. Finally, the quartet quieted, and Aunt Carol swept to the stage, tapping the microphone with a flourish. "Friends, colleagues, family," she began, her voice ringing with self-importance. "Welcome. We are here tonight to celebrate a monumental achievement. The legacy of my brother, my dear Arthur." She launched into a gushing, saccharine speech about his genius, his mystique, and, most tellingly, his need for protection. "For decades," she declared, her eyes sweeping the room, "our family has made it our sacred duty to protect him, to shield his incredible sensitivity from the harsh, grasping world. We have always known how to protect him from exploitation, from those with less than pure intentions who might seek to use his name for their own gain." She shot a quick, venomous glance in my direction. A few people in the crowd, those who knew the family history, shifted uncomfortably. Most just applauded politely. It was the perfect setup. She couldn't have written a better opening for me if I had paid her. When she finished, David Chen walked to the podium. His presence was a stark contrast to Carol's flamboyant drama. He was calm, centered, and commanded respect. "Thank you, Carol," he said, his tone perfectly neutral. "Good evening, everyone. I'm David Chen, Arthur Vance's publisher. It is an honor to be here to launch a book that has been a decade in the making, not in the writing, but in the waiting. Waiting for the right time, the right circumstances, and most importantly, the right author." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Arthur Vance is, as you all know, a man of profound privacy. Finding an author he would trust with his life story, with the keys to his kingdom, was a monumental task. The acclaimed biographer Julian Croft was, we all thought, the only possible choice. His name alone guaranteed the quality and integrity the project demanded. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "However," he continued, a slight smile playing on his lips, "Julian Croft has been a pen name, a necessary fiction to protect the author's privacy during what became a deeply personal and transformative project." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see Carol and Marcus exchange a confused look. This was not part of their script. "The author," David said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, "wanted the work to speak for itself, to be judged on its own merits without any preconceived notions. But tonight, with the work complete and the story told, it's time to give credit where credit is so richly due. The author of The Silent Quarry is with us tonight." My heart was a trip hammer against my ribs. This was it. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. David scanned the crowd, his eyes passing over critics, over family, until they landed, with deliberate finality, on me. The person who spent the last year excavating the truth of a brilliant, complicated man, not with a pickaxe, but with compassion, skill, and unflinching honesty, is his daughter, Naomi Vance. A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound I will never forget. It was a sound of shock, of disbelief, of 100 different narratives shattering all at once. Time seemed to slow down. I saw Aunt Carol's face, a mask of horror. Her skin went from flushed pink to stark white in a matter of seconds. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Beside her, Marcus's jaw went slack, and the champagne glass he was holding slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute silence. Every single head in the room swiveled to face me. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what they would see. And then, a new movement broke the tableau. My father, who had been standing at the side of the stage, walked to the podium and took the microphone from David's hand. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his voice thick with emotion but ringing with a clarity that reached every corner of the silent room. "She is the finest journalist I know," he said, his voice unwavering. "And she is the best, most courageous daughter a man could ever ask for." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the frozen faces of our family. I was a fool. A proud, terrified fool. And for 10 years, my world was impoverished. My heart was silent, because of that foolish pride. My sister speaks of protecting me. The truth is, the only thing I needed protection from was my own fear. And the only person who was ever brave enough to face it with me is standing right there. He turned back to me, his love a tangible force in the room. "Naomi didn't just write my story. She didn't just document my life. She gave me back my voice. She gave me back myself. This book is not my legacy. This book is our reconciliation. It is a testament to her grace, not mine. He held out his free hand to me, a simple, powerful gesture that bridged the chasm of a decade. Come up here, Julian, he said, his voice breaking on my pseudonym. Come on home. I walked toward the stage, my legs feeling strangely steady. The path through the crowd parted for me as if by magic. As I stepped onto the stage, my father wrapped me in a fierce hug, burying his face in my hair. I'm so proud of you, he whispered, for my ears only. And in that moment, in front of the world that had cast me out, the applause began. It started with David, then the critics, then the family friends. It was hesitant at first, a smattering of claps, but it grew quickly, swelling into a thunderous, rolling ovation. It wasn't just for the book. It was for the story they had just witnessed, a real-life drama that was more powerful than any fiction my father had ever written. The only people not clapping were my aunt and cousin. They stood frozen in the middle of the room, their faces a mixture of humiliation, fury, and utter bewilderment. They looked like statues from a forgotten, irrelevant empire. Later, as my father and I were mobbed by a swarm of genuine well-wishers, editors wanting to meet me, critics praising the narrative structure, old friends of my father's looking at me with newfound respect, my aunt and cousin finally pushed their way through. Carol's demeanor had undergone a shocking transformation. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a flustered, desperate attempt at salvaging the situation. Naomi, she stammered, touching my arm as if we were the dearest of friends. We had no idea. Why on earth didn't you tell us? The question was a masterpiece of deflection, an attempt to paint me as the deceptive one. A year ago, I would have dissolved. Tonight, I felt a calm, cool clarity. I looked her directly in the eye, my voice even and low. You made it perfectly clear my voice wasn't welcome here, Aunt Carol, I said without malice. We did this the only way we could, with privacy and honesty, two things that were sorely missing from this family a decade ago. Her face fell. She had no response. Marcus, ever the opportunist, tried a different tack, attempting a chummy, conspiratorial tone. Wow, Naomi, you really pulled one over on us. Brilliant. So, listen, since you're in with the publisher now, do you think you could introduce me to that senior editor from the Times? I have a manuscript of my poetry that I didn't let him finish. I just held his gaze, my expression unreadable. I don't think so, Marcus, I said softly. Then I turned my back on them both, a simple act of boundary setting that felt more powerful than any argument, and rejoined my father. I left them standing alone in the middle of the crowded room. The architects of my exile suddenly exiled themselves. Much later, when the last of the guests had departed and the caterers were quietly packing up, my father and I found ourselves in his study. The very room where my life had been torn apart 10 years prior. The air was different now. The ghosts were gone. It was just a room, filled with books and the scent of old paper. He poured us both a small measure of a very old scotch. We sat in his leather armchairs, the ones that had faced off like adversaries a decade ago, and sipped in comfortable silence. I meant every word of what I said tonight, Naomi, he said quietly. I know, Dad, I replied. So did I. The power had shifted, not just in the family, but in the world. By the next morning, the reviews were starting to pour in online, and they were ecstatic. They praised the book's literary merit, its psychological depth, but most of all, they were captivated by the incredible story behind the story. My phone began buzzing incessantly. Emails flooded my inbox. They weren't from tabloids. They were from the biggest names in publishing and journalism, offering me book deals, columns, and feature assignments. I was no longer Naomi Wallace, the scrappy journalist. I was no longer Arthur Vance's disgraced daughter. I was Naomi Vance, the acclaimed author of The Silent Quarry. I had finally written a story so powerful it had rewritten my own life. A year has passed since that night. The biography became an international bestseller. It won awards I had only ever dreamed of. But more importantly, it healed something that I thought was broken forever. My life is very different now. I'm currently a writer in residence at a prestigious university, working on my next book, A novel this time, entirely my own creation. My father and I talk on the phone every Wednesday. We don't always talk about books. We talk about the weather, about the robins that have built a real nest in the old oak tree, about the small, ordinary things that make up a life. He is still a recluse to the rest of the world, but he is not a recluse to me. He is just my dad. The door to his study is always open. My relationship with the rest of the family is civil and distant. Aunt Carol sends overly sentimental Christmas cards signed with far too many exclamation points. Marcus tried to pitch me a collaborative screenplay idea a few months ago. I had my new agent politely decline. I see them at the occasional family gathering, and the interactions are stilted and awkward. They try to be warm, but there's a wariness in their eyes. They don't understand the new me, the one who doesn't need their approval. The truth is, I don't hate them. I just don't need them anymore. The desperate, aching need for their validation that defined so much of my young life has simply evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet, solid sense of my own worth, forged in silence and solitude, and finally claimed in a room full of people. Looking back, the 10 years of silence were a gift. They were painful, they were lonely, but they forced me to build a life, a career, and an identity that belonged only to me. My father's rejection, the cruelest thing that had ever happened to me, became the catalyst for my own becoming. He thought he was casting me out into the wilderness, but he was really just forcing me to find my own way home. The greatest lesson I learned is that your value is not a reflection in someone else's eyes. It is not something that can be given to you or taken away by family, no matter how much you love them. It is something you build, piece by piece, story by story, truth by truth, until it is a fortress that no one can tear down. Being underestimated, I've learned, can be a secret superpower. It allows you to work in the dark, to grow in ways no one expects. And when you are finally ready, you can step into the light on your own terms.